We're seeing the Western political media class bleating the word unprovoked in unison again, this time in reference to the massive multi-pronged operation launched by Hamas against Israel on Saturday morning, which reportedly killed hundreds of Israelis. Isn't it strange seeing the same oddly specific word choice inserted over and over and over again about the same event in statements by politicians and pundits, regardless of their political affiliation? When you lay them out together, it starts to sound highly suspicious. It's clear by now that whenever you see the word unprovoked being forcefully repeated in a uniform way across the entire political media class, whatever they're talking about was definitely massively provoked. As Palestinian-American writer and comedian Amr Zar put it on Twitter, 75 years of ethnic cleansing, 15 years of blockade, confiscation of Palestinian lands, pogroms on Palestinian towns, desecration of Palestinian sacred sites, daily raids into Palestinian homes, constant humiliation of an entire people. Nothing about today is unprovoked. Arguably the single most egregious display of war propaganda in the 21st century occurred last year, when the entire Western political media class began uniformly bleating the word unprovoked in reference to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Right now, if you're a respectable writer, you want to write in the main journals, you talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have to call it the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's a very interesting phrase. It was never used before. You look back at like in Iraq, which was totally unprovoked. Nobody ever called it the unprovoked invasion of Iraq. In fact, I don't know if the term was ever used. If it was very marginal. Now you look it up on Google and hundreds, thousands of hits. Every article comes out has to talk about the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Why? Because they know perfectly well it's provoked. It doesn't justify it, but it was massively provoked. Top US diplomats have been talking about this for 30 years. So therefore we have to call it the unprovoked invasion. I mean, any good shrink could tell you what's going on, It's not very profound.
Skillful manipulators make frequent use of a cognitive bias known as the illusory truth effect, a glitch in the way human minds tend to operate, which makes it hard for us to differentiate between the experience of hearing a well-evidenced fact and the experience of hearing something that they've heard repeated multiple times. If you want the public to believe something false, you won't be able to use facts and evidence to make your case against them. So what you can do is just repeat something over and over again until it starts sounding like the truth.
President Putin actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his border. This is fundamentally not about NATO expansion.
It was never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
It's absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
And it has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
Yeah, he's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason.
This is not about NATO expansion. This is about the democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
We are protecting democracy right now.
Ukraine is banning political parties.
Because it's a democracy.
Ukraine restricts books and music.
It's about democracy.
Ukraine won't hold elections.
It's about democracy.
And it's not about NATO expansion.
This war in Ukraine is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
That's not about NATO.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO expansion.
It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement. In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
It's not about NATO encroaching.
It was not about NATO. NATO is just a fictitious, imaginary adversary for Mr. Putin and for Russia.
It was never about NATO.
That's not what it's been about. It's been about him trying to expand his sphere of influence.
Hang on, I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, Russia has wished for a sphere of influence over Ukraine, but if the West had not challenged Russian interests so directly, I think that there was a chance to avoid this war.
He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. We rejected that.